It certainly is a joy to be able to assemble together once again in the commodious setting here where we have good heat and in summertime we have good cooling system. A little bit too much heat sometimes, but nonetheless we're blessed above and beyond what we deserve always, and we have been blessed to be able to assemble here again together as we've experienced once again a holiday called Thanksgiving, and about probably a 5-pound Thanksgiving for me, I think. But of course we constantly are mindful that God blesses us more than just on that Thursday every year, but it is a special time in which we're able to be with one another, and might be the reason why we have extra people here today. We're certainly thankful for whatever brought you here. We're glad you are here, and hopefully with an open Bible and an open mind, we'll put ourselves to the task to be better people when we leave than when we came in. That's exactly the reason why we are here. We are worshiping our Father in spirit and in truth. We're blessed to have that opportunity, but we also have the obligation to grow spiritually. And the only way that spiritual growth ever results is when an individual is determined that that's what they're going to do. It's not something that accidentally happens. It's not something that happens because you happen to be sent by somebody that's growing and it rubs off on you. Although there is a certain amount of influence involved in spiritual growth, but we have to all individually and personally put ourselves to the task to be more Christ-like each day that we live. If y'all noticed here lately, and of course some noticed, I know, and some probably didn't know and don't care. And in the final analysis, I don't guess it really does matter, but the Chicago Cubs finally won a World Series. Just to tell you the truth, I didn't watch a single inning of the World Series. I don't care. My team's not Chicago Cubs. My team is San Francisco Giants, and I could care less what happens in Chicago. I wish there wasn't near as many people getting killed in Chicago as they presently are. But as far as the Cubs, that really doesn't, one way or another, you know, I don't care. But there's a whole lot of people that did care too. As a matter of fact, if you would have listened to the internet or maybe observed what's going on in the country, you would have thought that probably the Cubs is the favorite baseball team of all time. Everybody's a Cubs fan. Well, is that right? And how did it ever get like that? A phenomenon, of course, that's, you know, not just something I would observe, but there have been a whole lot of other people that observe that too. And you start thinking about why is that, you know? What's the closeness to the Cubs? You don't have the same closeness to the Bears, you know. I like the Bears. They play in the black and blue division, you know, play against Green Bay 2 times a year, but people don't care that much about the Bears or the Bulls, maybe a little bit back when Michael, but for some reason the Cubs got everybody's attention. And it was really amazing that down in Florida, where many of the Major League Baseball teams will go, you know, for spring training, that almost throughout the whole state of Florida, everybody in Florida was Cubs fans, even though right down the road, the Cleveland Indians at Winter Haven were having their spring training. How do you explain that? Is it just something that happened, or there is a reason behind it? And maybe, you know, I overthink things from time to time, but I think there's a reason for that. Of course, there's kids here that won't have a clue about anything I'm fixing to say probably, but those that are my age, a little bit younger and a little bit older, remember a time before there was any such thing as cable television. So, what? You mean we've not always had 200 channels to choose from? Yeah. When we moved to Dunlap, we had 2 channels that you could see. There were supposed to be 3, but one of them we couldn't see. It's too fuzzy. And then it came over time that you had 3 local channels, and they'd throw in, for good measure, a couple of national channels. And one of those national channels that they threw out there for everybody to watch 24/7 if they wanted to was WGN, which is out of Chicago. And you got to watch every Cubs game, if you wanted to, in the middle of the day. You know, there's the Cubs playing. And people got real familiar with the Cubs because you get tired of watching soap operas all day on those other channels, and so people were tuned into the Cubs. It became commonplace then for people to keep up with the Cubs because that was something they were exposed to all the time. And that ended up affecting not just the generation that lived back during that ancient time of no cable system, but they ended up passing on that commodity of Cub paraphernalia to their kids. And now all the way down to the grandkids. It was because what they were familiar with. They're familiar with. Oh, I remember well when the Braves moved from Milwaukee to Atlanta. There again, I don't care. I'm a Giants fan. It may be closer to Atlanta than it is to San Francisco, but still, that's not going to change my affiliation. But there were people around here that automatically became Atlanta Braves fans because that was the closest team to pull for. That's fine, you know, except when you're playing the Giants. That's fine. It was something they were familiar with. They could become a part of a whole lot easier. Now, the fact is, obviously, you know, every now and then you'll find people who live in the state of Tennessee who are proud that they live in the state of Tennessee. They use our resources, and yet they'll pull for some other team outside the state. I don't understand that at all. But it's not because of something they're more familiar with. There's some other reason why they pull for those other teams. But it's all because of a familiarity and some kind of connection that has been made in the past that causes their present behavior to take place. We're not. Now, ultimately, obviously, it doesn't have anything to do with our eternal destiny as to which team you pull for. Well, I don't know. There may be some that, no, it doesn't really. And while we might have an affinity for this baseball team or this football team, and there's reasons behind that that's been passed on from generation to generation to generation, really those things will not matter in eternity, will they? But there is also the tendency for us from time to time to get real familiar with and real satisfied with and see nothing wrong with other situations that we are not just exposed to, but become a part of on a regular basis. That's when it starts mattering. Not happen to the color you're going to wear on a Saturday or a Sunday or a Monday night, but what you become familiar with, even to the extent that your perspective is influenced because of what you are familiar with and satisfied with to a certain extent. So I said, what in the world are you talking about? Well, think about the tune of the whole book of Psalms set in the very first Psalm. Psalm 1, the very first one. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in that law doth he meditate day and night. Now notice the emphasis at that very first verse. Here is the progressive nature of an individual. The progressive nature of an individual who passingly is associated with that which is not right, becomes more familiar with to the extent that he actually spends greater amount of time with such individuals or situations. And then he ends up making his abode with those very individuals who just a few short days ago, it was only a passing glance that he gave them. It developed over time. To where now, guess what? He doesn't feel out of character at all to be spending time with these that the Bible describes as scornful, disobedient, hypocritical unbelievers. Now, it didn't happen just like that. But over time, he became so familiar to that setting that he was satisfied to stay in that setting. You know, years ago, of course, I use a whole lot of illustrations from the Boilermaker days, you know, and I'll just tell you, it was difficult to be a Christian in a boiler shop. And I remember a little old saying that goes on the front of the bulletin from time to time. It says, if you can't be a Christian where you are, you can't be a Christian anywhere. Well, that sounds a certain way, but it sort of leaves the impression that It's not difficult to be a Christian in any setting you might imagine. But that's simply not so. That's not so. It's difficult to be the person that sticks out like a sore thumb when you're the only one that's sticking out like a sore thumb in a particular setting, whether it's a boiler shop, whether it be on the job, or even in the family, even. Almost to the extent that in order to save difficulties and problems and obstacles and hard things, you just decide, well, I'm just not going to stick out like a sore thumb because it's a whole lot easier just to go with the flow. Right? That's when our familiarity with things can be detrimental to us not only here, but be detrimental to us eternally. Start off walking, end up sitting down right in the middle of that which is false. Became accustomed to it. To what do we become accustomed to that could absolutely jeopardize our soul? I've been thinking a whole lot here lately about free moral agency. And we know how to say that, We know the basic concept of free moral agency, which means that individuals are free to choose. And we're talking here about accountable human beings. In spite of the fact that the circumstances surrounding them are not what they ought to be, ultimately, an accountable human being has the obligation given by God to do the right thing. Now, it is the case oftentimes, and we use this terminology, that they've got a whole lot stacked against them, It's almost as if they're going to have to be Superman to get out of the situation that they're in because there's so many things wrong that they're having to deal with on a daily basis. But yet, ultimately, God holds them accountable individually and personally for making the right choice in spite of that. Or else we don't possess free moral agency after all. But we do. But we do. Obviously, we need to look for those individuals who maybe are striving to do the right thing and have those things stacked against them, as it were, and try to assist them. But ultimately, we have to admit that people end up being in eternity where they choose to be. Everybody does. Everybody does. In spite of the reverses in life that we face, in spite of the hills that oftentimes have to be climbed, we still are all personally held responsible. But when we put ourselves in a situation of walking, then standing, then sitting among the ungodly, the sinners, and the scornful, don't you see how that can so afflict our perspective on things that we absolutely can feel comfortable in situations that we really ought not feel comfortable in? And then what happens when this comfortable situation that we have developed ends up being the situation in which our children are observing? What then? What then? Even though our conscience doesn't bother us, the conscience of our children is bothered. Are we going to see to it that they follow our example to the point where their conscience is not bothered either when they simply follow in our footsteps? When they simply do what we have modeled for them is all right to do? You see, we got a long way away from pulling for the Cubs, didn't we? A whole lot away from it. When we become comfortable with what the world has to offer, then I submit our very best friend is the one that tells us we need to quit being so comfortable. And I want to be your friend. I want to be your friend eternally. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33, Paul says, "Be not deceived." Now you mark it down. Whenever you see an inspired man introducing an idea with those words, the possibility exists that individuals will be. And so he's saying right up front, don't be deceived into believing anything different than what I'm about to tell you. Evil communications or evil companionships corrupts good morals, corrupts good manners. It does. Don't be deceived into believing that it doesn't. Don't be deceived into thinking that this small deviation from what I ought to be doing in the final analysis will not matter. Because I promise you, when that small deviation that you have accepted from the way you ought to be doing is observed by an offspring, don't be surprised if they follow your small deviation. They'll do it. And they'll do it not convinced that's the right thing to do, but they'll do it because they observed you do it. And they're convinced you can't do any wrong. First thing you need to do is tell them you can too. You can too. Parents make mistakes. Preachers make mistakes. Elders make mistakes. We all make mistakes. The wise and courageous parents, elders, preachers, anybody is the one that says, I was wrong, don't follow that sorry example, we're going to do better. We're going to do better. And instead of getting cozy with the world, what should our attitude and action be? Well, here's a couple of verses that helps us to understand it. From the inspired pen of the psalmist, and I think David is one that wrote this 26th psalm. Listen to verses 4 and 5. I have not sat with vain persons, either will I go in with dissemblers. Somebody says, well, I'm glad I don't know what that is, because I can't mess up and do that if I don't know what a dissembler is. Well, a dissembler is in actuality a person that is playing the part of somebody else. So it's just a hypocrite. What does the psalmist say? He says, I'm not going to spend time with worthless people, and I'm not going to go in and spend time with hypocrites. Verse 5, I have hated the congregation of evildoers, and will not sit with the wicked. Now you sort of get the idea from the inspired pen of David here that it's our obligation to run as far away from that which will jeopardize our soul as we possibly can, instead of getting cozy with it. I dare say that common sense would tell us that, even if the Scriptures didn't, wouldn't you? For sure. The wise man Solomon writes in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 14, 15, enter not into the path of the wicked, and walk not in the way of evil men. Avoid it, pass by it, turn from it, and pass on. Sounds like to me, when Paul told that young preacher Timothy to flee, that's the idea. It's not get cozy with, not cuddle up next to, that which will jeopardize your soul, but get as far possibly away from it as you can. You see, in stark contrast to all of these things that can take us in the opposite direction, we have the encouraging words and the admonition of John in 1 John chapter 1 and verse 7, that if we walk in the light, as He is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Jesus Christ, His Son, cleanses us from all sin. Those are the type of situations, and those are the type of people that we should feel the opportunity to cozy up to. Those are the type of decisions, based upon where will I spend eternity, that should prevail when we're making decisions as to what we're going to do or what we're not going to do. It has to be the authoritative standard of God's Word, and not just what the world says we ought to do in this situation. Be not deceived. In Colossians chapter 1 at verse 10, may we always have the desire to walk worthily of the Lord unto all pleasing. Think about that. Here was the desire of the Apostle Paul of the church at Colossae. I dare say it was what he desired of the church at Philippi, the church at Corinth, the church at Ephesus, and certainly by extension, we could say this is exactly what the Lord would expect, demand, and deserve from the church at Dunlap. That we walk worthy of the Lord with all pleasing, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God. Is that the type of mentality that demonstrates itself in activity that is obvious to those who observe us? If so, then that's what our kids see too. That's what our nieces and nephews see too. That's what our neighbor sees too. And that is a life that brings eternal reward. The gospel is available for the totality of lost mankind. If you fit into the category of one who's never obeyed the gospel, then why not do so today? Become a child of God. Obey the gospel, being baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of your sins with the full assurance the Lord will add you to His church. Maybe in times past you've done just that, but have wandered away. Why not jump at the opportunity to return and to be restored, even right now, while together we stand and while we sing.